My name is Michael Harrison, and for 23 years I thought I had built the perfect life. I had a beautiful wife named Victoria, 2 incredible kids, a successful real estate business, and everything seemed to be falling into place. Victoria was stunning, charming, and everyone loved her. She was involved in every charity event in our town, volunteered at the nursing home every weekend, and seemed like the most caring, selfless person you could ever meet. Before starting this video, comment where you are watching from. We lived in a gorgeous colonial-style home in Connecticut, drove nice cars, and spent vacations in places most people only dream about. My parents thought she was the daughter they never had. Mom and Dad adored Victoria so much that they actually changed their will in her favor more than once. They wanted to make sure she felt like a true part of our family. My sister Jennifer lived out in California and wasn't as involved in our daily lives. So my parents saw Victoria as their second child, their future caregiver, their everything. When my dad had his first stroke at 68, Victoria was right there. She took 3 months off work to care for him. She managed his medications, took him to physical therapy, and handled everything with such grace and patience. My mother sobbed with gratitude. She kept saying, "We are so blessed to have you, Victoria. You are an angel sent straight from heaven." My dad recovered well enough to live another 5 years, but those 5 years, Victoria was always present, always helping, always the perfect daughter-in-law. I remember thinking I was the luckiest man alive. I had won the lottery with this woman. My parents loved her almost as much as they loved me. There were even jokes at family dinners about how if anything happened to me, Victoria could probably run the family business better than I could. But I didn't know the truth. I didn't know that every single day, Victoria was playing the longest con I've ever witnessed in my entire life. I didn't know that every smile, every act of kindness, every tear she shed was a calculated performance. I didn't know that while she was holding my father's hand during his recovery, she was also photographing documents in his office. I didn't know that while she was volunteering at the nursing home, she was studying how people commit fraud without getting caught. Looking back now, I can see all the signs I missed. The subtle questions about my parents' finances, the way she suddenly became best friends with my mother's lawyer, the fact that she encouraged my parents to update their will just in case something happened. All the things I was too blind, too trusting, too in love to see coming. And then my father died. It was peaceful, in his sleep at the age of 73. Victoria wept like her heart had been shattered into a million pieces. She gave an eulogy that had everyone in tears. She spoke about his wisdom, his kindness, his legacy. She made it seem like she had lost her best friend in the world. But everything was about to change. 2 weeks after my father's funeral, my mother wanted to go over the will with me and Jennifer. My sister flew in from California, and we sat down with our parents' lawyer, a man named Robert Griffin, who had worked with my family for over 30 years. Mom seemed nervous, which was strange. She kept wringing her hands and wouldn't quite look at Jennifer in the eye. Mr. Griffin opened the folder and began reading the document that my father had updated just 8 months before his death. The lawyer's voice was calm and professional as he outlined the specifics. My mother would receive the house and sufficient liquid assets to live comfortably for the rest of her life. Jennifer would receive $300,000 in inheritance and Dad's vintage car collection. And I would receive the rest, approximately $2 million in investments and properties, plus the family business valued at around $1.5 million. But then Mr. Griffin turned the page, and his tone changed slightly. "There's also an addendum," he said. Specifically regarding Victoria. I felt my stomach twist. Why would my father leave anything to Victoria? She wasn't blood. Sure, she was family by marriage, but it was unusual. "Your father," Mr. Griffin continued, "left Victoria a sum of $100,000 to be given to her in full upon his death." Jennifer's eyes went wide. I didn't react. $100,000 to Victoria seemed generous, but not outrageous. My father was a generous man, and Victoria had cared for him. It made a kind of sense, but my mother spoke up immediately. "That's not all," she said quietly. "There's more to this." "Robert, show them the other documents." Mr. Griffin hesitated. He pulled out more papers and slid them across the desk. These weren't part of the official will. These were documents that had been hidden away in my father's safe deposit box, along with specific instructions for my mother to reveal them to me after his death. My hands were shaking as I read them. They were medical power of attorney forms, nursing home placement documents, caregiver contracts, and they all bore Victoria's signature. More importantly, they all bore dates from the last 6 months of my father's life. My father had been planning for nursing care, but I never realized how serious it had gotten. These documents outlined a scenario where if my father became unable to care for himself, Victoria would have legal authority to make decisions about his medical care and living situation. And attached to these documents was my father's handwritten letter to me. I read it with tears streaming down my face. "Michael, if you're reading this, I'm gone. I need to tell you something that I couldn't tell you while I was alive because I didn't have proof. But I've been putting things together, and I needed to protect your mother. I've documented everything. I believe Victoria is not who you think she is. Check the banking records from the past year. Check the power of attorney forms. Check the documents in this box. I love you, son. Trust yourself and protect your mother." My entire world started to spin. That night, I couldn't sleep. I sat in my office with all of my father's documents spread out in front of me, and I started to dig. The letter he left me contained a safety deposit box number and instructions on how to access it. Inside, along with the legal documents, were photographs. Hundreds of photographs. My father had been secretly documenting everything. There were photos of documents on my mother's desk, photos of bank statements, photos of what looked like a forged signature on a document. And there were printed email exchanges, correspondence. Between Victoria and someone with an email address I didn't recognize, I called my company's IT specialist and asked him to help me trace the email address. It belonged to a man named Raymond Beck, who worked as a notary and document specialist at a small office downtown. I started to piece together what my father suspected. The next morning, I hired a private investigator named David Chen. I told him everything and asked him to look into Victoria's background and her connections to Raymond Beck. Within 3 days, I had my answer, and it was far worse than I could have imagined. Victoria wasn't even her real name. Her legal birth name was Victoria Mendez, but that wasn't the most shocking part. In the previous 15 years, she had been married 4 times. 4 times, Michael. Each marriage lasted between 2 to 5 years. And in each case, her husband or her husband's family members had experienced significant losses after their deaths or during the marriages. The first husband, a man named Daniel Cox, had died of a heart attack at age 56. After his death, his family discovered that significant assets had been transferred to Victoria's name in the months before his death. They pursued legal action, but Victoria had already moved to another state. The second husband, Thomas Reeves, had survived, but during their marriage, his elderly mother had been placed in a nursing home under very suspicious circumstances. Large amounts of money from the mother's account had gone missing. Thomas divorced Victoria when he realized what was happening. The third husband, a wealthy business owner named Marcus Williams, had died after a brief illness. His family suspected foul play but couldn't prove it. Victoria had received a $250,000 insurance payout and then disappeared. And then there was me. The fourth husband, and my parents were supposed to be her biggest score yet. The investigator uncovered bank records showing that Victoria had been slowly transferring small amounts of money from joint accounts she had access to, accounts shared with my parents. She had moved a total of $47,000 into a separate account over the course of 2 years. The transfers were small enough to go unnoticed but systematic, enough to show clear intent. She had also created forged power of attorney, documents that were never officially filed but appeared designed to give her control over my parents' assets in case of emergency. My father had discovered these documents when he was cleaning out his desk one day. That's when he started taking photographs and documenting everything. But the most terrifying part? Raymond Beck had been helping her create these documents. He had already been paid $15,000 for his services, and there were emails discussing plans for the next phase, plans that involved Victoria encouraging my father to move to a nursing home, which she would manage, giving her complete control over his daily care and his finances. My father's stroke and his eventual death may have derailed that plan, but Victoria's next target was obvious: my mother. I called my mother and told her to meet me at a restaurant away from the house. I needed to have this conversation somewhere public, somewhere I wouldn't lose my mind. When she arrived, I showed her everything: the investigator's report, the photographs, the email exchanges, the evidence of Victoria's previous marriages and previous victims. My mother's face went white. She kept shaking her head, saying over and over, "No, no, no. This can't be real. Not Victoria. Not our Victoria." But even as she was denying it, I could see the realization dawning in her eyes. She was remembering things, small incidents that hadn't made sense at the time, but suddenly made perfect sense now. Like the time Victoria had asked about transferring one of the investment accounts into a joint account for easier management. Like the time Victoria had mentioned that the nursing home where she volunteered had excellent memory care facilities and had suggested my father should consider in just to stay connected to the community. Like all the times Victoria had been in my parents' office, photographing or copying documents, always with some innocent-sounding excuse. My mother started to cry, angry, betrayed tears. She asked me what we were going to do. I told her my plan. I was going to confront Victoria directly, but first, I needed to make sure everything was documented legally. I called Robert Griffin, the family lawyer, and filled him in on everything. He immediately advised us to file a report with the police and to secure all of my parents' accounts against unauthorized access. That evening, I waited for Victoria to come home. She was at her volunteer work at the nursing home, and I sat in my office rehearsing what I was going to say. My hands were clenched into fists. I felt sick. I felt angry. But most of all, I felt stupid. How had I not seen this? How had I been so blind? When she walked through the door, she was laughing about her day, complaining about a difficult resident, and asking me if I wanted her to order Thai food for dinner. She was so normal, so perfectly infuriatingly normal. I told her to sit down. I told her we needed to talk, and then I laid it all out. I showed her the investigator's report. I told her I knew about Raymond Beck. I told her I knew about her previous marriages. I told her I knew about the money transfers, the forged documents, all of it. For a moment, she just stared at me. And then something shifted in her face. The mask slipped. The perfect wife disappeared. And what was left was cold, calculated, and utterly devoid of shame. "You don't have proof of anything," she said calmly. "I have an investigator. I have police involvement. I have bank records." "Bank records of what?" she asked. "Small transfers that could have been anything. A notary who knows me, so what? That doesn't prove I forged anything. As for my previous marriages, I'm allowed to have been married before. That's not illegal." She was right in a way. The evidence was circumstantial. But what she didn't know was that I had been documenting everything since that morning. And I had already been to the police. That's when the doorbell rang. 2 police officers were standing on my front porch, a search warrant in their hands. The search of our home revealed far more than we had initially found. In Victoria's office, a space I had never paid much attention to before, the police found a filing cabinet filled with documents, banking statements from accounts I didn't know existed, identification documents for 3 different aliases, forged medical power of attorney forms, and a journal, an actual physical journal where she had written detailed notes about her plans. Reading excerpts from that journal made my blood run cold. Michael is completely under my control. His parents trust me implicitly. Phase 1, secure financial access. Phase 2, ensure elderly patriarch is moved to facility for care. Phase 3, gain control of healthcare decisions. Phase 4, accelerate timeline for estate distribution. Need to check with Raymond about new documents by next week. There were pages and pages of this. Years of planning. Years of calculated deception. Each entry was dated and methodical. She had written about her first 3 husbands with clinical detachment, noting which schemes had worked and which ones hadn't. She had written about me with barely concealed contempt, describing how easy I had been to manipulate, how much my parents loved her, and how close she had come to her biggest payday yet. The police also found the forged documents that Raymond Beck had created, multiple versions of power of attorney forms, nursing home admission papers, and even a draft of an amended will that would have left significant assets to Victoria's name. These were never filed officially, but they existed, and the intent was crystal clear. Victoria was arrested on the spot. She didn't resist. She simply stood up, held out her wrists for the handcuffs, and smiled at me. Actually smiled, like this was all some kind of amusing game to her. "You'll never prove anything," she said as they led her away. "Have fun trying to explain to your kids why mommy's going away. Have fun explaining to your friends why your wife tried to steal from your parents. You're going to be humiliated, Michael, and I'm still going to walk away from this." But she was wrong. Raymond Beck was arrested the next day. His office was raided, and they found extensive records of the documents he had forged, the payments he had received, and the communications with Victoria. He immediately struck a deal with the prosecution and agreed to testify against Victoria in exchange for reduced charges. Turns out Raymond Beck didn't have the spine for actual criminality. The moment he realized he was facing real prison time, he folded like a cheap suit. The police also contacted the families of her previous husbands. Thomas Reeves, the second husband who had divorced her, was thrilled to finally have evidence to support what he had always suspected. He provided years of documentation about suspicious financial transactions and forgeries that he had preserved just in case. Daniel Cox's family couldn't take action, he was deceased, but they provided testimony about suspicious circumstances surrounding his death that led investigators to question whether her involvement had been more than just financial. And Marcus Williams's family? They reopened his case. With new information about Victoria's patterns and her access to his medications, the medical examiner agreed to re-examine the original findings. While they couldn't prove poisoning definitively, they did find evidence of unusual substances in his preserved tissue samples. The case was reopened as a potential homicide investigation. Victoria was facing charges of fraud, forgery, elder abuse, financial exploitation of the elderly, and conspiracy. The potential prison time was looking at 30 years or more. The media coverage was relentless. Local news ran stories about the Black Widow of Connecticut, exploring Victoria's history and her apparent pattern of targeting wealthy, older men and their families. National news outlets picked it up. I was suddenly the face of a cautionary tale about trusting the wrong person. My children struggled the most. My daughter, who was 16, faced ridicule at school. Kids made jokes about how her stepmom had tried to rob them blind. My son, who was 14, became withdrawn and angry. He blamed me for not seeing through Victoria sooner. He said I was stupid for not realizing what she was doing. And in many ways, he was right. I was stupid. I was blind. I had put my entire family at risk because I was infatuated with a beautiful woman who knew exactly how to manipulate me. Therapy became a regular part of our lives. Family counseling, individual counseling for the kids, and for me, something deeper, a kind of examination of why I had allowed myself to be so completely deceived. The therapist helped me understand that Victoria had deliberately targeted vulnerable people. She was a predator and I had been prey. It wasn't my fault that I was human and capable of being fooled by someone who had dedicated years to perfecting her deception. My mother fell into a depression. The betrayal had cut deep because Victoria's cruelty hadn't felt random. It felt personal. My mother had opened her heart to this woman. She had treated her like a daughter. And Victoria had repaid that love with the intention to rob her and potentially harm her. My mother started seeing a therapist too, and it took months before she could even talk about Victoria without becoming overwhelmed with emotion. My sister flew back to Connecticut and stayed with us for 3 weeks. She and I had difficult conversations about how we had both missed the signs, but she also said something that helped. This isn't on you, Michael. This woman is a predator. She's trained to do this. She knows how to hide the truth because she's spent her whole life lying. That's on her, not on you. The legal proceedings were lengthy. Victoria's trial began 8 months after her arrest. The prosecution's case was overwhelming. They presented bank records, forged documents, the investigators' findings, and Raymond Beck's testimony. They read excerpts from Victoria's personal journal. They brought in the families of her previous husbands to testify about the patterns they had observed. Victoria's defense attorney tried to argue that she had been trying to help an elderly man, that the power of attorney forms were simply precautions, that the money transfers were gifts. But the journal entries destroyed that narrative. There was no way to explain away her own words, no way to claim that she had been acting out of love and concern, when her own handwriting described her victims and her schemes in meticulous detail. I testified against her. I sat on the stand and described what I had discovered, how I had felt when I realized my wife was a serial con artist and potentially a murderer. Victoria watched me from the defendant's table with that same cold expression. At one point she smirked at me, like she still thought this was all a game. But the most powerful testimony came from Thomas Reeves, her second husband. He described how Victoria had nearly destroyed his elderly mother's life, how she had stolen thousands of dollars and left his family fractured and broken. He spoke about the guilt he felt for bringing her into his family's life, and the relief he felt that she was finally being held accountable. The jury deliberated for only 4 hours. 4 hours to decide the fate of a woman who had spent years deceiving. People, the verdict was guilty on all counts. Fraud, check. Forgery, check. Elder, abuse, check. Financial exploitation of the elderly, check. Conspiracy, check. The jury foreman read through each charge methodically. And with each guilty verdict, I felt something release inside me. It wasn't satisfaction exactly, because the damage had already been done. But it was validation. It was proof that I hadn't been crazy, that I hadn't imagined the betrayal, that the system could recognize evil when it was presented with evidence. Victoria remained stone-faced throughout the reading of the verdict. She didn't cry. She didn't show any emotion at all, which somehow made it worse, because it proved what the investigator had suspected all along. She genuinely didn't feel remorse. She didn't feel guilt. She didn't feel human emotion the way normal people do. She was a predator, pure and simple, and the lack of emotion in her face was proof of that. The sentencing hearing happened 3 weeks later. The judge, a woman named Margaret Sullivan who had been on the bench for 30 years, had clearly studied this case carefully. She gave a speech before handing down the sentence that I will never forget. Victoria Mendez has demonstrated a pattern of predatory behavior spanning at least 15 years and affecting multiple families. She has systematically targeted vulnerable individuals, exploited their trust, and attempted to steal from them financially. The evidence presented in this trial suggests that her crimes may have extended beyond financial exploitation to potentially causing physical harm. Her complete lack of remorse, as evidenced by her behavior throughout this trial, indicates that she poses a significant threat to society. Therefore, this court sentences you to 35 years in the state penitentiary. 35 years. At her current age of 43, she would be 78 when she was eligible for release, assuming she lived that long, assuming she didn't receive additional time for the reopened investigation into Marcus Williams's death. But the judge wasn't finished. She also ordered Victoria to pay restitution to all of her identified victims, money that she would likely never have to pay because she would be spending the rest of her natural life in prison. Still, it was symbolic. It meant that the court recognized her theft, her fraud, her exploitation, and demanded compensation from her, even if that compensation would never actually be rendered. As Victoria was led away in handcuffs to serve her sentence, she looked back at me one final time, and I saw something in her eyes that I had never seen before. Not remorse, not fear, but something like calculation. Like she was already thinking about her next move, already planning her appeal, already considering how she might work the system from inside prison. That's when I realized something crucial. Victoria would never stop being who she was. Prison wouldn't change her. Therapy wouldn't change her. She was fundamentally, irrevocably incapable of human connection or genuine feeling. She was broken in a way that had nothing to do with how she was raised or what happened to her in her past. She was simply a predator, and she would remain a predator for the rest of her life. The only comfort I took from that realization was that she would be doing it from inside a cage. In the months following Victoria's sentencing, My family began the slow, painful process of healing. My mother started gardening again, something she loved but hadn't done since my father's death. She said that working with the soil, planting seeds, watching things grow, it gave her hope. She also became more cautious about trusting people, which broke my heart in a different way. Victoria hadn't just stolen from my mother. She had stolen her ability to trust, to love openly, to believe in human goodness. My father's will was finally executed properly, and the inheritance was distributed as he had originally intended. My mother received what he had meant for her to receive. Jennifer got her portion, and I received mine. The $100,000 that Victoria had been left went into a victim's restitution fund, money that would theoretically be used to compensate any victims that Victoria's crimes could be definitively linked to. I used a portion of my inheritance to establish a trust fund for my children's education. I wanted them to have something good come from something so dark. I also hired a legal team to help protect my mother from any other potential predators. We updated all of her passwords, installed security systems, and had regular financial audits done. I was taking no chances. The real estate business continued, but I made changes to how I operated it. I became more cautious about partnerships. I hired a financial advisor who had credentials in fraud detection. I became what some of my colleagues called paranoid, but I preferred to call it educated by experience. My relationship with my children was strained for a while. My son struggled with the fact that I had brought Victoria into their lives. He felt that I had failed to protect them, and on some level, he was right. I had failed to see the danger until it was almost too late. It took 2 years of family therapy before he could forgive me for that failure, or rather, before he could understand that my failure was human and understandable, even if the consequences had been severe. My daughter worked through her embarrassment and anger in a different way. She volunteered for a charity that worked with victims of financial exploitation and elder abuse. She said that she wanted to help other people avoid what happened to her grandmother. Watching her channel her trauma into something productive was one of the most healing things I experienced during that period. For myself, I did a lot of personal work. I read books about manipulation, about narcissism, about the psychology of con artists. I wanted to understand how Victoria had fooled me so completely. I wanted to ensure that I would never be vulnerable to that kind of manipulation again. And I realized that the key to Victoria's success wasn't that I was stupid. It was that I had genuinely wanted to believe in her goodness. I had wanted my wife to be who she pretended to be. I had wanted my family to be happy and whole. And Victoria had exploited those very human desires. A therapist once told me that the opposite of love isn't hate. It's indifference. Victoria had mastered the art of appearing loving, while remaining completely indifferent to the people she claimed to care about. She had looked into my eyes and said, "I love you," and she had meant absolutely nothing by it. That was the hardest thing to come to terms with. Not that she had betrayed me, but that she had never genuinely connected with me in any meaningful way. Our entire relationship had been a performance. Every kiss, every kind word, every moment we spent together, it had all been an act designed to move her closer to stealing my family's money. But I survived. My family survived, and we came out the other side transformed but intact. Just when I thought the nightmare was finally over, the investigation into Marcus Williams's death took a significant turn. The reopened case had been assigned to a detective named Sarah Morrison, who was obsessed with Victoria's pattern. Detective Morrison believed that Victoria had poisoned Marcus Williams, and she was determined to prove it. Detective Morrison started by examining the medications that Marcus had been taking at the time of his death. According to his medical records, he had been prescribed blood pressure medication, cholesterol medication, and anxiety medication. But the medical examiner's office, when they reviewed the preserved tissue samples, found traces of a substance called digitalis, a plant-based poison that could mimic the effects of a heart attack. Digitalis is found in foxglove plants, and according to Marcus Williams's household staff, Victoria had been growing a garden of ornamental plants, including foxglove. She had even mentioned to one staff member that she enjoyed the challenge of identifying different plants and learning about their properties. It wasn't definitive proof, but it was compelling circumstantial evidence, combined with Victoria's pattern of targeting wealthy older men, her ability to access Marcus's medications, and her clear intent to inherit his estate. It painted a picture. The prosecutors in the original case decided to file additional charges. Victoria was now being charged with second-degree murder in connection with Marcus Williams's death. This added another 30 years to her sentence. She was now looking at 65 years total, effectively a life sentence even though she was only in her 40s. When I heard the news, I felt a complicated mix of emotions. Relief that the justice system was working to hold Victoria accountable for what appeared to be an actual murder. But also a kind of horror that it had taken so long to uncover, that Marcus Williams had been dead for 7 years before anyone seriously investigated whether his death had been anything other than natural causes. I reached out to Marcus Williams's family, his adult children from a previous marriage who had always suspected that something wasn't right about his death. They were grateful. They said they had suspected Victoria all along, but couldn't prove it. They thanked me for my role in exposing her, even though I hadn't directly been involved in reopening Marcus's case. Victoria fought the new charges. Her lawyer tried to argue that the toxicology findings were inconclusive, that there were no witnesses to any poisoning, that circumstantial evidence wasn't enough, but the prosecution was thorough. They presented detailed evidence of Victoria's interest in plants and their properties. They presented the household staff's testimony about the foxglove garden. They presented the medical examiner's findings, and they presented her pattern of targeting wealthy older men. The second trial was shorter than the first one. The jury deliberated for 6 hours before coming back with a guilty verdict on the murder charge. Victoria received an additional 30 years, concurrent with her existing sentence, meaning she would spend her entire life in prison. This time, when the verdict was read, I saw something shift in Victoria's face, just for a moment. The mask slipped and I saw something that might have been fear, or rage, or something else entirely. But it was the first time I had seen her display anything resembling genuine emotion, and it was both satisfying and deeply unsettling. After the trial, Detective Morrison reached out to me personally. She told me that she believed there were potentially other victims, that Victoria's pattern extended back further than we knew, to a time before she had started her string of marriages. She was working with authorities in other states to investigate cold cases that might be connected to Victoria. It's been 3 years since Victoria's conviction, and the investigation is still ongoing. Detective Morrison believes that Victoria has potentially killed as many as 5 people, that my wife, the woman I loved, had killed multiple people to acquire wealth and then moved on to the next victim. I don't think about Victoria very often anymore. When I do, it's usually with a sense of detachment rather than anger. She's serving her time. She's locked away. And even though the legal system is slow and imperfect, it eventually worked. It eventually caught her and stopped her from hurting anyone else. While Victoria was serving her criminal sentence, the civil suits began. My mother filed suit against Victoria's estate to recover the money that had been stolen from her and my father. Thomas Reeves, Victoria's second husband, also filed, and Marcus Williams's family pursued a wrongful death case. The civil trials were different from the criminal trial. The burden of proof was lower. It was preponderance of the evidence rather than beyond a reasonable doubt, and the damages could be far more extensive because they could include punitive damages designed to punish particularly egregious behavior. Victoria had very little to her name at this point. Most of her assets had been seized as evidence or frozen as part of the investigation, but she did have a small amount of money that had been recovered from various accounts, and that money became the subject of fierce competition among the victims. The court ordered that Victoria's personal assets be liquidated to pay restitution to her victims. Her jewelry was sold at auction. Her car was sold. Bank accounts were emptied. In the end, there was enough money to pay each victim a portion of their claimed damages, though it was far less than what had actually been stolen from them. But the civil suit served another purpose beyond financial compensation. They created a public record. They documented Victoria's crimes in excruciating detail, and they ensured that her actions would be remembered, studied, and used as a cautionary tale for years to come. Law schools began using the Victoria Mendez case as a teaching tool for learning about financial crimes and elder exploitation. The case became famous in legal circles as an example of how predators can hide in plain sight, and how important it is to have systemic safeguards against financial exploitation. I was interviewed for a documentary about financial crimes against the elderly. It was difficult to relive everything on camera, but I felt like it was important. The documentary has been shown on multiple platforms, and I've received emails from people who have recognized signs of financial exploitation in their own family situations because of watching it. One email particularly struck me. A woman named Patricia wrote to say that she had recognized Victoria's pattern in her own situation. Her mother-in-law had married a man who seemed wonderful, but had started encouraging the family to move assets into joint accounts and update wills in her favor. Because of the documentary, Patricia had investigated and discovered that the man had been involved in a similar con in another state. She alerted the authorities, and he was arrested before he could fully execute his plan. Patricia wrote, "You saved my family from disaster. Thank you for being brave enough to share your story." That email meant more to me than any legal victory. 2 years into Victoria's sentence, her legal team filed an appeal. They argued that her trial had been biased, that the media coverage had been prejudicial, that certain pieces of evidence should have been inadmissible. It was the kind of appeal that happens in almost every criminal case, and it's usually not successful. But I had to live through the process of rehashing everything again. The appeal court took 2 years to consider the case. During that time, I checked the legal databases regularly, dreading the day when I would see a headline saying that Victoria's conviction had been overturned, or that she was being granted a new trial. But in the end, the appeal court upheld Victoria's conviction, every count, every finding of guilt. The judges ruled that her trial had been fair, that she had adequate legal representation, and that the evidence against her was overwhelming. They noted that her pattern of behavior was so clear and so extensively documented that it would be nearly impossible for a jury not to find her guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. Victoria's legal team filed another appeal, this time with the state Supreme Court. Again, we waited. Again, the court reviewed the case. And again, the conviction was upheld. Victoria exhausted her state appeals and moved on to federal appeals, which are notoriously difficult to win. The federal court declined to hear her case, ruling that there were no constitutional violations in her trial and no new evidence that would warrant review. That was the end of the line for Victoria. She would serve her sentence. On the day that the federal court issued its final decision, I felt a profound sense of relief. It was over. It was finally truly over. Victoria would be in prison for the rest of her natural life, and there was no legal mechanism left for her to challenge that reality. I called my mother and told her the news. She cried, but they were different tears than before. Not tears of pain or betrayal, but tears of closure. She said, "It's finally finished. It's finally over." 5 years have passed since Victoria's final appeal was denied. Life has moved on in ways both expected and surprising. My children are adults now. My daughter graduated from university and works as an advocate for elder abuse victims. My son became a forensic accountant, inspired by the investigation into Victoria's financial crimes. Both of them have taken the trauma of their childhood and transformed it into something meaningful. My mother is doing well. She volunteers with senior citizens, but this time with a clear eye toward identifying potential exploitation. She's trained to spot the warning signs that she missed with Victoria. She says that if she can prevent even one elderly person from being victimized the way she and my father were, then something good will have come from her pain. I remarried 3 years ago. Her name is Emily, and she's nothing like Victoria. She's a nurse who works with chronic pain patients. She's kind, but not in that theatrical way Victoria was. Her kindness is quiet and genuine. She doesn't volunteer for everything or try to charm every person she meets. She's real, and it took me years to trust that realness. But eventually I did. When Emily and I were dating, I did background checks on her. I verified her employment history. I spoke to her family members. I was thorough in a way that probably seemed paranoid to an outside observer, but Emily understood. She knew about Victoria. She knew why I needed to be careful, and she patiently allowed me to verify her identity in every way possible before I allowed her to become close to my family. The business is thriving. I've become more selective about partnerships, but I've also become more secure. I know how to identify red flags now. I know what to look for when someone is being too generous or too helpful. I know that sometimes the people who seem the most perfect are hiding something. I still receive messages from time to time. People who have watched the documentary or read about the case and want to share their own stories of betrayal or financial exploitation. I try to respond to as many as I can. I've become something of an informal advisor to people who suspect they're being targeted by con artists or financial predators. There's a part of me that will always carry the wound of Victoria's betrayal. But it's not a fresh, bleeding wound anymore. It's scar tissue. It's hardened and strengthened me in ways I never expected. I'm more cautious now, but also more aware. I'm more cynical in some ways, but also more appreciative of genuine human connection. Victoria is still in prison. She's now in her early 50s. According to the few prison records that become public, she's been a model inmate. She doesn't cause trouble. She works in the prison library. She keeps to herself. Some might say she's rehabilitated. But I don't believe in her rehabilitation. I think she's simply waiting and calculating. Sometimes I wonder what she thinks about when she's alone in her cell. Does she regret anything? Does she think about the families she destroyed? Or is she simply plotting, planning, waiting for the day when she might be released? When she might have the chance to hurt someone again? I'll never know the answer to that question. And I've made peace with that uncertainty. Just when I thought everything was resolved, something happened that shocked me to my core. I received a letter, handwritten, from Victoria, from prison. The envelope had my name on it, addressed to my home. It had gone through the prison mail system, been screened for safety, and delivered to me by my mailman on a Tuesday afternoon. My hands were shaking as I opened it. The letter was 6 pages long, written in Victoria's neat, precise handwriting. She apologized, not in a generic way, but specifically. She apologized to my mother for trying to steal from her. She apologized to my father, posthumously, for her deception. She apologized to me for betraying my trust. She acknowledged her crimes in detail and expressed what appeared to be genuine remorse. But then the letter took a turn. She wrote about her childhood, about how she had been abused by her stepfather, about how she had learned early that the only way to survive was to become someone else, to adapt to whoever would keep her safe. She wrote about the first time she had realized that men would do anything for a woman who knew how to manipulate them. She was 14. She had used that power to escape a dangerous situation. She wrote, "I'm not asking for forgiveness, Michael. I'm not asking for anything at all, but I need you to understand that I wasn't born a monster. I became one. I chose a path that allowed me to survive, and I kept walking down that path long after I needed to survive anymore. I kept walking because I didn't know how to stop. I don't know if I'm capable of genuine remorse. My therapist here says I might be, but I know that I hurt people. I know that I destroyed families, and I know that I deserve to be here." I read that letter 5 times. I showed it to my therapist. I asked her if she thought Victoria was being genuine or if this was another con, another manipulation. My therapist said she couldn't tell. She said that the letter had elements that suggested genuine introspection, but also elements that could be calculated to manipulate me into advocating for her early release or a reduced sentence. I decided to respond, not because I forgave her. I'm not sure I ever will, but because I needed closure. I needed to have a conversation with Victoria that wasn't adversarial or legal. I needed to ask her questions and hear her answers. Over the course of the next year, Victoria and I exchanged letters. It was the strangest, most psychologically complex dialogue I've ever participated in. Through letters, Victoria told me about her life, about her marriages, about what had motivated each con, about the times she had genuinely felt something for her victims before the predatory instinct had kicked in. She told me that she had cared about my father, that his stroke had genuinely frightened her because she had started to see him as a real person rather than a target. She said that the moment she realized she actually cared about him was the moment she knew she had to get out of that situation. not because she was capable of genuine love, but because genuine feeling was dangerous to her plans. She told me that she had loved my mother, that the betrayal of my mother had been the only moment in her adult life where she had felt something resembling guilt. She said it was this guilt that had made her hesitate on the final step of her plan. If my father hadn't died when he did, she might have walked away. She might have left my family and moved on to the next target, and she told me about me. She said that I had been different from her other husbands, that she had intended to keep me as long as possible because life with me had been genuinely pleasant, in a way that she hadn't anticipated. She said that losing me, not as a victim to a con but as a person, had been the most difficult part of her imprisonment, not because she loved me, but because I had become real to her in a way that most people never did. I asked her in one letter, "Are you capable of being loved?" She wrote back, "I don't know. I've spent my whole life assuming that I wasn't. But now I wonder if I'm not capable of being loved, because no one has ever tried to love the real me. They've all loved the version of me I created for them. Maybe I'm not a monster, Michael. Maybe I'm just a broken person who learned to hurt others before anyone could hurt her." Through my correspondence with Victoria, I learned something that the police and the investigators had missed. There had been another victim, a woman, not a man, a friend of Victoria's from childhood named Sophie Harris. According to Victoria, Sophie had been her only genuine friend. They had met in foster care. Victoria had been moved around constantly after her mother abandoned her, and Sophie had been in the same group home for a period of time. They had bonded over their shared trauma, and years later, when Victoria was in her 30s, she had reconnected with Sophie. Victoria had manipulated Sophie into co-signing a mortgage on a property in Sophie's name, while Victoria handled the finances. Victoria had then taken out predatory loans against that property without Sophie's knowledge. By the time Sophie realized what had happened, Victoria had already disappeared, and Sophie was left with hundreds of thousands of dollars in debt. Sophie had lost her home, her credit, her savings. She had attempted suicide twice and was now living in a group home for adults with mental health issues. Victoria wrote, "Sophie was my one real friend, and I destroyed her. If there's anything I regret in this world, it's what I did to Sophie. Because with Sophie I knew I was hurting someone who loved me, and I did it anyway." I tracked down Sophie and contacted her. She was hesitant to speak with me at first, but eventually agreed to meet. When I saw Sophie in person, I understood immediately why Victoria had felt something for her. Sophie was gentle, vulnerable, kind. Everything that Victoria wasn't, and everything that Victoria's abuse should never have been directed at. Sophie told me her story. She told me that she had forgiven Victoria years ago, not because Victoria had asked for forgiveness or earned it, but because holding on to anger had been destroying Sophie's life. She said that she had moved past the betrayal, and while she had lost her savings and her home, she had eventually rebuilt her life. Sophie also told me something else. She said that Victoria had once confessed to her, back when they were in group care together, before Victoria's predatory nature had fully developed, that she didn't know how to love. That she had asked Sophie, "How do you love someone without needing to control them or hurt them?" And Sophie had told her, "You just do. You open your heart and you trust them. You let yourself be vulnerable." Victoria never learned that lesson, or she learned it too late to apply it to her life. I helped Sophie sue Victoria's remaining assets in civil court. We won a judgment for $250,000, though we both knew we would only collect a fraction of it. But it wasn't about the money. It was about acknowledging that Sophie had been a victim, that her pain was valid, that what Victoria had done to her had mattered. Sophie and I became friends after that. We would meet for coffee occasionally and talk about our experiences with Victoria from different perspectives. Sophie had been victimized by the woman Victoria truly was, cruel and calculating. I had been victimized by the woman Victoria pretended to be, loving and trustworthy. We both learned that we had been hurt by the same person, but in completely different ways. Through my friendship with Sophie, I came to understand something that I had never quite grasped before. Victoria's abuse had less to do with what was wrong with me or with my family, and more to do with what was wrong with Victoria. Her capacity for manipulation, her complete lack of genuine empathy, her predatory instinct. These were her characteristics, not reflections of our failings. We had been targeted by a skilled predator, and that said nothing about us except that we were human. 10 years have passed since I discovered Victoria's betrayal. 10 years since my world was turned upside down. Victoria is now in her late 50s, serving a 65-year sentence in the state penitentiary. She's become what the prison records describe as a model inmate. She's never causing trouble. She's become the prison librarian. She started mentoring younger inmates who have experienced abuse. I've thought about whether I forgive her. The answer is complicated. I don't forgive her for what she did. What she did was unforgivable. The pain she caused to my family, to Sophie, to Marcus Williams's family, to all of her victims. That's not something that can be erased or excused. But I've come to a place of acceptance about who she is. I accept that Victoria is broken in a fundamental way. I accept that she may have been made that way by trauma, or she may have been born that way. I accept that it doesn't matter which one is true, because either way, the result is the same. She hurt people, and she was stopped. My mother passed away peacefully 2 years ago at the age of 86. Before she died, she asked me to visit Victoria in prison one final time. She wanted me to tell Victoria that she forgave her, not because what Victoria did was forgivable, but because holding on to rage had been keeping my mother from fully healing. She wanted Victoria to know that my mother was choosing peace over bitterness. I made that visit. I sat across from Victoria in the prison visitation room, separated by glass and years of pain. Victoria cried when I told her about my mother's forgiveness. For the first time, I believed her tears were genuine. For the first time, I thought I saw something in her that resembled real human emotion. But then something shifted in her eyes. That cold calculation returned, and I realized that even in that moment of apparent emotion, Victoria was still performing. She was still putting on a show, still trying to manipulate, still unable to be fully present in genuine emotion. That's when I truly let go of my anger, because I realized that Victoria was a prisoner in more ways than one. She was imprisoned by her broken nature, by her inability to connect, by her eternal need to deceive. My children have both thrived. My daughter's advocacy work has helped protect dozens of elderly people from financial exploitation. My son has built a successful career as a forensic accountant, helping families recover stolen assets and identify financial crimes. They've turned their pain into purpose. I've also noticed something interesting. I'm actually grateful for what happened to me. I know that sounds insane. I know that sounds like Stockholm Syndrome or some kind of trauma response. But the truth is, Victoria's betrayal broke me open in a way that allowed me to become a better person. I'm more empathetic now. I'm more aware of the suffering of others. I'm more careful about who I trust, but also more generous with those I do trust. The pain of betrayal taught me to see people more clearly, both their capacity for deception and their capacity for genuine goodness. I started a nonprofit organization that helps families identify and prevent elder exploitation and financial crimes. We provide education, legal assistance, and support for people who have been victimized. The organization has helped hundreds of families protect themselves and recover from financial crimes. It's one of the best things I've ever done with my life. Victoria's story, and my story, has become a case study. Law enforcement agencies use it to train officers about recognizing patterns in financial crime. Social workers use it to understand how predators operate. Lawyers use it to educate families about protecting their assets. In a strange way, the worst thing that happened to me has become a tool for helping others. If you're watching this and you recognize signs of financial exploitation or predatory behavior in your own life, I want you to know you're not alone. You're not stupid for being fooled. You're not weak for trusting the wrong person. Predators are experts at deception, but you can protect yourself. You can get help. You can recover. And if you've already been betrayed, if you've already had your trust shattered and your family harmed, I want you to know that you can rebuild. It's hard. It takes time. It takes therapy and support and sometimes legal help. But you can come out the other side. You can transform your pain into purpose. You can help others avoid your fate. Victoria may never fully understand what she did or why it was wrong. She may spend the rest of her life in prison, never achieving genuine rehabilitation, never becoming the kind of person who can connect authentically with another human being. But that's her tragedy, not ours. We have the power to choose a different path. We have the power to choose healing, growth, and meaning. My name is Michael Harrison, and this is my story of betrayal, justice, and redemption. Thank you for listening.